The wind that night carried a strange sound across the wide valley, half whistle, half cry. It came rolling down from the mountains, brushing over the dry grass and through the half-broken fences of a forgotten ranch. Folks in town had already started whispering earlier that week that something wasn't right out there. The rancher hadn't been seen in days, and the smoke from his chimney had turned from the soft gray of cook fire to a darker shade, heavy and bitter. Out here in the late 1800s, when neighbors lived miles apart, silence itself could feel like a warning. And that night, silence was all the valley had, until the scream tore through it. No one in the nearby village would forget the echo that followed. It wasn't the cry of a coyote or the wail of a lonely wind. It was human, short, sharp, and cut off mid-breath. Old-timers at the saloon swore later they felt it in their bones. The rancher had always been a quiet man, known for keeping to himself. He owned more acres than anyone within a half-day's ride, but worked them alone. His wife had passed the previous winter, and some said he'd never been the same. They said grief does strange things to a man, makes him hear voices in empty barns and talk to fences like they could answer. But others, those who'd seen his eyes when he came to town for supplies, said it wasn't grief anymore. It was something else, something darker. The ranch sat at the far end of a dry riverbed, where the dust turned red and the sun seemed to stay longer than anywhere else. Cattle wandered too close to the canyon edge, and coyotes had been coming down earlier in the season. A storm had swept through days earlier, bending trees and flooding gullies. After that, nobody had dared ride out there. Not until the store clerk noticed the rancher's wagon still sitting in town, half loaded with flour and rope. He'd left it there after muttering something strange, something about not being able to hold it in anymore. The clerk didn't understand what he meant, and when he asked, the rancher just gave a slow, tired smile. "Just make it quick," he'd said. Then he walked out, heading toward the open plains. For 3 days, nobody saw him. The wind carried whispers instead, of the rancher's horses standing restless near the barn, of lanterns flickering inside when no hand should have been there to light them. On the 4th night, one of the neighbors, a widow living 2 miles east, claimed she saw movement. A single light weaving through the field, slow and uneven, like someone dragging something heavy behind them. She wanted to ride out and see, but her fear kept her on the porch until morning. By then, the light was gone, and the only sign left was the faint smoke drifting from the ranch's chimney again, thicker than before. The sheriff wasn't much for stories, but even he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When he finally decided to send a deputy to check on the place. The man came back pale, shaking, unable to speak for a full minute. He said the barn doors were chained shut from the outside, and there were marks on the ground, deep grooves, like something had been dragged. He didn't stay long enough to look inside. The sheriff, thinking it might be rustlers or drifters, gathered a few men and rode out himself that evening. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving everything bathed in the reddish glow of twilight. The place looked deserted. The windows were covered, the front porch sagging under years of neglect. But the horses were still there, nervously pawing the ground, their eyes rolling white in the fading light. The men dismounted and called out, but no voice answered. Only the faint creak of wood and the moan of the wind replied. When they stepped closer to the barn, one of them noticed something strange, a shovel leaning against the door, clean, as if freshly used. Beside it lay a torn piece of cloth, stained dark, half buried in the dust. Inside, the air felt heavy. It wasn't just the smell of animals. It was older, thicker, the kind of air that told you something terrible had happened. The sheriff pushed open a stall and found tools scattered everywhere. Axes, ropes, chains, and something else. A small pile of broken boards, each with dark smudges along the edges. In the far corner, near the old feed barrels, lay a trail of footprints, leading out the back door and down toward the well. The men followed, their boots crunching on dry dirt. When they reached the well, the rope was missing. Only a rusted pulley remained, spinning gently in the wind. One of them leaned over, struck a match, and let it fall. The flame flickered down into the blackness, showing nothing but water far below. Still, they swore they heard something move down there, faint but alive. The sheriff called out, his voice echoing off the stone walls. No answer came. But then, from the shadows of the barn behind them, a door slammed. The horses reared, kicking up dust and fear. The men turned, weapons half drawn. But the sound that came next wasn't from any intruder. It was the rancher himself, stepping out slowly, his face half hidden beneath his hat, his hands blackened with dirt. He looked thinner, older, like years had passed in just a few days. His eyes were distant, like he wasn't really seeing them at all. The sheriff took a step forward, asking where he'd been, but the rancher didn't answer. He just whispered, barely loud enough to hear. I told her I couldn't hold it in anymore. I told her to make it quick. No one knew what he meant, but the tremble in his voice made the men uneasy. The sheriff asked again, this time sharper, but before he could finish, the rancher lifted his hand and pointed toward the barn. She's still there, he said. She wouldn't leave. The men exchanged glances. The sheriff motioned for two of them to go inside, but when they did, the smell hit them first, strong and sour, like something that had been left too long in the heat. They came out moments later, white as ghosts. One muttered a prayer, another turned away and vomited into the dirt. The sheriff, gripping his revolver tighter, demanded the truth. The rancher just stared at the ground. I tried to bury it, he murmured, but it keeps coming back. Thunder rolled far off in the mountains. A storm was brewing again, dark clouds crawling over the peaks. The men didn't wait to find out more. They left him there, standing alone beside the barn, as the first drops of rain began to fall. By morning, when they returned with more men, the rancher was gone. The barn stood open, the chains broken, and inside, nothing. No sign of him, no trace of what they thought they'd seen the night before. Only the sound of the wind whistling through the rafters and a faint echo rising from the well, as if something deep below was still calling out. From that day on, no one set foot on the ranch again. The land grew wild, fences fell, and the story turned into something the townsfolk whispered around firelight. But even years later, riders passing through that valley would say the same thing. On quiet nights when the wind blew just right, you could still hear it, the rancher's voice strained and broken, repeating the same words over and over. I can't hold it in anymore. Just make it quick. And no one ever stayed long enough to find out what he meant. The next morning, a heavy mist covered the valley like a shroud. It softened the outlines of the hills and made the old ranch look almost peaceful from a distance. Though everyone in town knew peace had long since left that land. The sheriff stood on the ridge with two deputies, their horses shifting uneasily beneath them. None of the men spoke much on the ride back. The silence carried its own kind of weight. The events of the previous night had left something lingering in their minds, a feeling that the ranch wasn't empty, even though it looked that way. As they approached, the sheriff noticed the tracks were gone, washed away by the rain. The ground was soft and fresh, and the well rope that had been missing before now hung neatly coiled beside it. The barn doors creaked in the wind, open this time, revealing a dark, hollow space inside. The tools that had once been scattered were neatly arranged along the wall. It was as if someone had spent the night cleaning up, setting everything back in order. Only one thing didn't fit, the sound. A slow, rhythmic tapping echoed from inside, steady and measured, like someone working on wood. The sheriff raised his hand, signaling the others to stay back. He walked in alone. The smell of rain mixed with old hay, damp and heavy. The tapping stopped. He waited, listening until the silence returned, thick enough to make the air feel heavy. Then, from the far corner near the feed barrels came a whisper, soft, trembling, almost like a breath. He turned, lantern raised high, but the corner was empty. Just the shadows playing tricks again, he told himself. Still, the moment he stepped out into the daylight, he could swear he heard footsteps behind him. Back in town, word spread fast that the rancher's land had gone strange. A few said it was cursed, others claimed it was haunted by his wife's spirit. Some remembered the night she died, how she'd fallen ill after the harsh winter, how no doctor could reach her in time, and how the rancher had buried her alone. There had been no preacher, no service, just a cold morning in a mound of earth behind the barn. People had offered help, but he'd refused every time. She's resting, he'd said, voice dull and distant. But a few who passed by afterwards swore they'd seen him sitting by that grave long after sunset. whispering softly like he was still talking to her. The widow from the east, the same woman who'd seen the light in the fields, couldn't shake the image from her mind. She'd known the rancher before his wife passed, a good man, quiet but kind. She remembered his laughter at the market, how he'd tip his hat when passing by. But after the winter took his wife, his visits grew rare, and when he did come, his eyes looked hollow. Once she'd tried to speak to him, asking if he needed help keeping the ranch running. He'd simply said, "Some things a man has to finish himself." Those words had stayed with her ever since. Now, she found herself standing on her porch again, watching the horizon where the ranch sat hidden behind the mist. Something deep inside urged her to ride there, not out of curiosity but out of worry. She saddled her horse just before dusk and started toward the valley. The air was cool and sharp, filled with the scent of wet earth. As she rode closer, she noticed the land seemed quieter than usual. No birds, no crickets, not even the rustle of small creatures. The closer she got, the more it felt like the world was holding its breath. When she reached the ranch, she saw smoke drifting from the chimney again. Her heart raced. Someone was home. She dismounted carefully, tied her horse to the post, and knocked on the door. No answer. She knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. The third time, the door creaked open by itself. Inside, the air was still, the kind that made you whisper even when no one was around. She stepped inside and called out, her voice barely more than a murmur. The front room was dim, lit only by the faint glow from the hearth. A single chair sat by the fire, rocking slowly back and forth though no one touched it. On the table beside it lay a Bible, open to a page she couldn't make out, its edges scorched as if it had been too close to the flame. A photograph leaned against it, a woman in a simple dress smiling faintly, her eyes calm. The widow recognized her, the rancher's wife. She took a step closer, but her foot brushed against something soft on the floor. It was a handkerchief, embroidered with delicate flowers and initials that matched the woman in the photo. The edges were damp, as if someone had just been holding it. Then, from deeper inside the house came a faint sound, humming. A tune so quiet, so broken it made her skin crawl. It was a lullaby, one the rancher's wife used to hum at church gatherings long ago. The widow turned toward the sound and followed it down the hallway. The walls were lined with old pictures, all slightly tilted, their glass cracked or fogged. At the end of the hall stood a door, half open, revealing the dim outline of what seemed to be a bed. The humming stopped. For a long moment there was nothing, no movement, no voice, just the faint creak of the floorboards beneath her boots. She reached for the doorknob, hesitated, and then pushed it open. The room was empty. The bed was neatly made, a folded quilt resting at its foot. On the nightstand sat a small oil lamp and a wooden box. The lid was carved with initials, hers and his. She opened it slowly and found a handful of dried flowers inside, the same kind people placed on graves. Beneath them was a folded letter, its edges yellowed with age. She unfolded it with trembling hands. The words inside were faint, written in the rancher's uneven script. If love could hold the soul, she'd still be here. But love can't keep the dead from calling. She dropped the letter back into the box, her heart pounding. Something cold brushed the back of her neck, a draft, she told herself. But when she turned, she saw the door she'd entered through had closed. The air felt colder now, heavier. From somewhere behind the wall came a dull thud, then another, like someone striking wood. It stopped, then started again, slower, almost deliberate. The widow backed toward the hall, her hand gripping the frame for balance. When she finally reached the porch, the night had settled thick around the ranch. She mounted her horse and rode hard back toward the village, not daring to look back. She didn't speak of what she found until the next day, when she showed the sheriff the letter. He read it twice, then folded it neatly into his coat. "Don't tell anyone about this," he said quietly. "Not yet." Over the next few weeks, more strange things happened. Travelers passing near the ranch spoke of seeing a man standing in the fields at night, holding a lantern, staring toward the hills. Others claimed to hear two voices, one deep and weary, the other soft and broken, talking in the wind. A ranch hand found his cattle refusing to graze anywhere near that stretch of land, and one horse was discovered tangled in barbed wire, as if it had bolted from something unseen. The sheriff returned once more before winter set in. He found the front door wide open and the rocking chair still moving by the fire. The Bible was gone, and the photograph lay face down. He walked through the rooms calling the rancher's name, but no answer came. The barn was empty, except for a single lantern hanging from the beam, still burning, though no one had lit it for days. He turned to leave, but as he reached the gate, He heard it again. That same voice from before, faint but clear. "I told her to make it quick." The sheriff froze. The words came not from the house but from beneath the ground near the old well. He stepped closer, peering into the darkness below, but all he saw was the faint shimmer of water. Then, for just a moment, the reflection shifted. Two shapes instead of one standing beside the other. When he blinked, it was gone. He rode back to town without looking behind him once. From that day on, no lawman, no preacher, no curious soul dared go near the ranch again. The land remained untouched, the buildings left to rot under the weight of time. But every now and then, when a storm rolled through the valley and the wind carried that same whistle across the plains, people swore they could hear it again. The rancher's broken whisper carried through the dark. "I can't hold it in anymore. Just make it quick." And somewhere beneath the echo, another voice answered. The weeks turned into months, and the ranch became something of a scar across the valley. Untouched, avoided, but never forgotten. The folks in town tried to go about their lives as usual, yet it was hard to ignore the feeling that something unseen was watching from the hills. The widow couldn't sleep most nights. Every time the wind picked up, she'd hear faint tapping against her window, like knuckles brushing the glass. Once, when she opened the curtains, she thought she saw a lantern glowing faintly out near the old well, but when she blinked, it vanished. She began lighting a candle each night, not out of faith but fear, whispering quiet prayers that the rancher's soul had found peace. Deep down, she knew it hadn't. The sheriff hadn't been the same either. The night he looked into that well had changed him. He stopped going to church, stopped joining the men at the saloon. Some nights he rode out alone toward the hills and sat staring at the valley, as if waiting for something, or someone to appear. His deputy worried for him, said he was hearing things that weren't there. But the sheriff knew what he'd heard. That whisper hadn't been wind. It was too human, too filled with regret. He'd spent years chasing criminals and thieves, but nothing in his life had ever felt like this, a mystery without shape or motive. Only an endless echo of guilt hanging in the air. It was around that time a new man rode into town. He said he was a land surveyor, though his clothes looked too fine and his questions too pointed. He wanted to buy the ranch, claimed it had water rights worth salvaging. The townsfolk warned him, told him the place wasn't right, but he only smiled, saying he didn't believe in ghost stories. Money was his only gospel. The sheriff told him to leave it alone, but greed has a way of deafening men. Within days, he'd set up camp by the ranch and started digging near the well, saying he was testing the soil for minerals. That first night, he slept fine. The second, not so much. Folks nearby said they heard shouting echo through the valley, followed by a gunshot. When morning came, his horse was found tied to the fence, but he wasn't. The only thing left was his campfire, still warm, and his journal half buried in the dirt. The sheriff read what was left of it. The last entry chilled him to the bone. "There's something down there. It isn't water. It sounds like breathing." After that, no one questioned the curse again. The land went completely quiet, almost too quiet. Coyotes stopped coming near. Birds avoided flying overhead. Even the grass seemed to grow slower. People whispered that whatever the rancher had done, it hadn't ended with him, that something beneath the soil still stirred, waiting. The widow began visiting the church again, but not to pray. She wanted answers. She spoke with the old pastor, a weary man who had lived there longer than most. He told her he remembered the rancher's wife before she died. She'd come to him once, desperate, asking for guidance. She'd said her husband had changed, that he was hearing voices at night whispering from the well, calling his name. The pastor had offered to visit, but she begged him not to. "It doesn't want you," she'd said. "It only wants him." Days later, she was gone, and the rancher had buried her alone. The widow left the church shaken. That night, she wrote a letter to the sheriff, begging him to burn the place down and put whatever was there to rest. But the sheriff never answered. He'd already gone out there himself, riding under a moonless sky, determined to find the truth. He left word with his deputy that if he didn't return by dawn, to seal the road and keep everyone away. The deputy waited, but the sheriff didn't return. When the first light broke, the deputy gathered 2 men and rode to the ranch. They found his horse grazing near the gate, saddle torn and reins dragging. The house stood open as if waiting for them. Inside, everything was still, except for a faint dripping sound from the back room. The deputy followed it to find the water bucket overturned, wet footprints leading to the door. The trail ended near the well. There, on the wooden beam above it, hung the sheriff's badge, still glinting in the weak morning light. No sign of him anywhere. Fear settled over the valley like a second winter. The widow stopped leaving her house altogether, locking her doors before sunset. But even then, the ranch didn't leave her alone. One night she heard soft knocks again, 3, steady and slow. When she opened her eyes, she saw a shadow through the thin curtain standing by her porch. Too afraid to speak, she waited until dawn, then stepped outside. There were no footprints in the dirt, only a wet handprint pressed against the wooden rail. As the months passed, the story spread far beyond the village. Travelers came through hoping to catch a glimpse of the haunted ranch, but most left before sundown. Some claimed they saw figures moving near the barn, 2 shapes walking side by side. Others said they heard someone whispering from the well, asking to be freed. No one ever stayed long enough to prove it. By the next spring, the widow couldn't take it anymore. She decided to leave, to move east where the land was green and the nights were quiet. On her last day, she rode out one final time to the ridge overlooking the valley. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the fields. The ranch stood silent below, roof sagging, windows broken. Yet from that distance she could swear she saw smoke again, curling gently from the chimney. And in that smoke she thought she saw 2 figures, one tall, one smaller, standing together at the door facing her. She blinked, and they were gone. She turned her horse to leave, but a sound stopped her, the faint ring of metal, like a chain dragging against stone. It came from the wind, or maybe from deep below the earth. Her heart pounded as she looked back once more. The well glimmered faintly in the fading light, and for the briefest moment she saw ripples move across the surface. It wasn't rain, it was something stirring. That night, as she packed her belongings, she found an envelope slid under her door. No name, no seal, just a single line written across the front. Don't let them forget. Inside was a photograph, the same one from the ranch, the smiling woman in the simple dress. But this time there was something different. Behind her, in the faint blur of the background, stood the rancher, half turned, his face shadowed, and beside him a third figure, too pale, too still, almost blending into the wall. She dropped the photo and backed away, her breath trembling. She didn't sleep that night nor the next. By the time the wagon came to take her east, she looked back at the valley one last time. The mist had returned, thick and white, swallowing the land whole. Years later, folks said she never spoke of that place again. But sometimes, when storms swept through and the thunder rolled low across the plains, travelers claimed to see a flicker of light in the distance, out where the old ranch once stood. Some said it was just lightning. Others weren't so sure. The land remembers, they'd say. Every story, every sorrow, it holds on. And on nights when the air grows too still, when even the crickets go quiet, if you listen close enough, you can still hear that voice carried on the wind, fragile and fading, yet always there. I can't hold it in anymore. Just make it quick. And somewhere far off in the echo of the hills, another voice answers. Calm, almost kind. It's already done. The summer came hotter than any before. The sun burned the valley dry, and the wind carried dust instead of rain. The few who still lived near the edge of that land said the air felt wrong, thicker somehow, as if the ground itself was holding its breath. Travelers stopped passing through altogether. Even the mail rider refused to cross the ridge after sunset. People said he'd seen a light moving across the plain the week before, slow and steady, like a lantern carried by an unseen hand. When he got close enough to make out the shape, the light vanished, and all that was left was the faint smell of smoke and the creak of rope swinging in the wind. By then, the widow had been gone a year. Her old house stood empty, windows boarded and door chained. Yet every so often, someone passing at night claimed to hear movement inside. Footsteps pacing the floor, or the sound of a woman humming softly through the cracks. Most dismissed it as the wind, but a few of the older townsfolk said otherwise. They believed the widow hadn't left at all, that she had gone back to the ranch before she disappeared, searching for something she'd left behind. The sheriff's deputy had taken over his duties by then, though his hands shook every time he signed his name. He didn't like to talk about the old ranch, but he couldn't stop thinking about it either. The memory of finding the badge on the well haunted him. Sometimes he swore he could still hear the faint ring of metal when the nights grew quiet. He told himself he'd go out there just once more, to lay the ghosts to rest, or at least to see for himself that nothing remained. One evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains, he saddled his horse and rode out. The road to the ranch had nearly vanished, swallowed by weeds and shifting soil. The air smelled of ash, though there hadn't been a fire in months. He reached the gate just as darkness fell, and the world around him seemed to hold still. The barns were little more than skeletons now, their beams jutting out like ribs. The house leaned forward, roof sagging, door half open. The wind brushed through the grass, and the sound that came with it wasn't quite wind. It was whispering, faint and uneven, like someone trying to speak through water. He called out, his voice cracking in the dry air, but no one answered. He stepped into the yard, boots sinking in the soft dirt. Near the well, the rope was gone again. The beam above it creaked gently, and something about it made his stomach twist. He thought of the sheriff's last words before riding out that night. "If I don't come back, don't look for me. Just seal it up." But standing there now, the deputy couldn't bring himself to leave. He had to know. He tied his horse to the post and approached the well. It looked deeper than he remembered, though maybe it was just the shadows. He leaned forward, struck a match, and dropped it in. The flame fell a long way, flickering as it went, until it finally hit the water below. And for a moment, the reflection staring back up wasn't his. It was a face, pale and still, eyes open, lips barely moving. The match hissed out, leaving nothing but darkness. He stumbled back, heart hammering. A sudden gust of wind blew across the yard, slamming the barn door shut behind him. The sound echoed like thunder, and from somewhere inside he heard that same slow tapping he'd read about in the sheriff's notes. Tap. Pause. Tap. Then a dragging sound, steady, scraping across the wood. His hand went to his holster, though he wasn't sure what good a gun would do against the dead. He forced himself toward the barn. The air inside was thick and cold, the kind that pressed against the skin. Dust floated in narrow shafts of moonlight coming through the cracks. The tapping stopped. He called out again, but his voice died in his throat. Then, from the far end of the barn, something shifted, a shadow rising behind one of the stalls. It moved slow, deliberate. He lifted his lantern, the light trembling in his grip. "Who's there?" he demanded, though it came out more like a plea. The figure didn't answer. It stepped closer, and the lantern flame dimmed, flickering as if choked by unseen breath. The deputy caught only glimpses, a worn coat, a hand blackened with soil, the faint glint of something metal at the chest. Then the face tilted upward, and for a heartbeat he saw it clearly. The sheriff, or what was left of him. The skin was gray, drawn tight, and his mouth barely moved when he whispered, "You shouldn't have come." The deputy dropped the lantern, light spilling across the dirt. The sheriff's figure vanished in the flash of smoke, leaving only the echo of footsteps retreating toward the well. The deputy ran out into the night, gasping for air, his heart pounding so loud he could barely hear. But even over his own breath he could make out the faintest sound, someone murmuring from below the earth. Not words exactly, but rhythm, like a prayer said backward. He mounted his horse and rode hard back to town, not daring to look behind him. When he finally reached the sheriff's office, the lanterns were still burning. He locked the door, sat at his desk, and began to write. The words came out shaky and uneven. "The well is open again. He's not alone down there. Tell them to leave this place." That letter was found the next morning, but the deputy wasn't. His horse was discovered wandering near the dry riverbed, saddle torn. After that, the town began to empty. The blacksmith left first, then the preacher. Even the saloon shut its doors. By the time autumn came, only a handful of people remained, those too stubborn or too poor to leave. They kept their windows shuttered and their lamps burning through the night. When storms rolled in, they swore they could hear voices carried on the wind, calling names long forgotten. One night, as lightning tore across the sky, the widow's old house lit up from within. A traveler passing through saw it from the ridge and rode down, thinking someone had moved in. But when he reached the porch, he found the door swinging open, hinges groaning. Inside, the air smelled of wet wood and something faintly sweet, like wildflowers left too long in the sun. On the table lay the same photograph, the smiling woman, the rancher, and the faint third figure. But this time the rancher's hand was resting on the shoulder of the ghostly blur, and in the lower corner of the photo, new words had been scratched in with something sharp. "It's not over." He left without looking back, and by morning, the story spread again. Some said the spirits were restless because the land was never consecrated. Others said the rancher had made a bargain, one that couldn't be undone by death. A few believed it was simpler, that love and guilt had tied two souls to the same ground, unable to move on. Whatever the truth, the valley changed after that. The ground near the well began to crack, and water seeped up in places it never had before. The cattle that strayed too close were found standing still at the edge, staring into nothing, refusing to move until they were dragged away. As winter crept closer, a new sound began to echo through the nights. It wasn't the whispering anymore. It was something heavier, deeper, a steady thudding from underground like the beat of a distant drum. Those who stayed said it grew louder each night, as if the earth itself was waking. No one dared go near, but everyone could feel it. The tension hung over them, a storm that wouldn't break. And on the coldest night of that year, when the moon vanished behind clouds and the valley went pitch black, the light returned, a single glow from the direction of the ranch swaying like a lantern in a trembling hand. Then a second light beside it, smaller but moving in perfect rhythm. Two shapes walking the same slow path toward the well. The townsfolk gathered at the ridge, watching in silence as thunder rolled across the plains. The light stopped at the edge, and for a long moment nothing moved. Then, faintly, they heard it, the rancher's voice, carried once more through the wind, clearer than it had ever been. "I can't hold it in anymore," the second voice answered, soft and almost tender. "Then let it go." And the lights vanished, swallowed by the storm. By morning the storm had passed, but the valley felt changed. The air hung still, heavy as if holding the memory of what had happened in the night. The townsfolk who had watched from the ridge didn't speak of what they saw right away. Some said the lights were only lightning. Others swore they'd seen figures walking toward the well side by side, until the earth swallowed them. No one dared go closer, not for several days. The fear of that ranch had lived too long in their bones. But when the sun rose on the third morning, curiosity finally outweighed fear, and a few men rode out together to see what was left. The road to the ranch was covered in branches and debris from the storm. When they reached the valley, the land looked different. The barn that had stood like a dark skeleton for years was gone, reduced to a heap of ash and scattered boards. The chimney of the house was still upright, smoke curling lazily from its cracks even though there was no fire. And the well, what had once been a black hole at the heart of the ranch, was filled to the brim. The rain had flooded it, leaving the water clear and still. One of the men leaned over and saw the reflection of his own face looking back. For the first time there was nothing staring back at him. No whisper, no shadow, just silence. They buried what remained of the place that day. The men worked until dusk, piling stones over the well and driving a wooden cross deep into the earth. The sheriff's name and the rancher's name were carved into it side by side. No one could say for sure what had happened, but everyone agreed that whatever was trapped beneath that land had finally come to rest. When they left, the valley was quiet. Even the wind seemed gentler, as if the hills themselves could breathe again. Weeks passed, then months. The town began to come alive again in small ways. The saloon opened its doors, the church bells rang on Sundays, and people started planting gardens in their yards. The fear that had once held them by the throat loosened its grip, but the story of the rancher never died. It became part of the valley's heartbeat, passed down in hushed tones at the supper table, a reminder of what grief could do to a soul if left to rot in silence. The widow's house was eventually bought by a traveling family who came west, looking for a new beginning. They said they found a folded letter tucked between the floorboards when they moved in. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. "If I can't be forgiven in life, may the land forgive me in death." No one ever learned who wrote it. Some thought it was the rancher's final confession. Others believed it was the sheriff's. Either way, it was left in the church, beside the old Bible that once belonged to the rancher's wife. By the next spring, wildflowers began to grow where the ranch once stood. Yellow blooms covered the earth where the barn had burned, and the well, sealed and silent, became surrounded by tall grass. Travelers passing through would stop and rest there without knowing what the place had once been. The locals didn't tell them. Some stories, they figured, belonged to the land alone. Still, on certain nights, when the moon hung low and the mist rolled back in from the hills, those who lived closest swore they could hear the faint creak of a rocking chair. It came from nowhere in particular, drifting on the breeze soft as a sigh. The widow's old neighbor, an elderly man who had known the rancher in his youth, would tip his hat toward the valley whenever he heard it. "He's keeping watch," he'd say. "He ain't gone. Just resting easy now." Years turned into decades, and the town itself began to fade, just like all old places do. Railroads came, new towns grew, and the valley was left behind, swallowed by grass and memory. By the turn of the century, only the stone cross remained, half buried and weathered by time. Travelers sometimes stumbled upon it and wondered who it belonged to, their fingers tracing the faint letters carved into its face. They never knew the story, only that the air felt heavier there, as if it remembered things they didn't. Long after, a historian passing through found an old journal at a county archive, the deputy's unfinished notes. The pages spoke of guilt and sleepless nights, of the rancher's decline, and of a secret buried too deep to stay hidden. The last entry was dated the night before his disappearance. It read, "He said the voices weren't angry anymore. He said they were waiting. I think he's finally ready to face them." The historian published the account in a small local paper, calling it a frontier tragedy of love and loss. People read it, nodded, and moved on. But for those who lived near the valley, it meant something more. They said the story wasn't just about one man's fall into madness, but about what happens when sorrow is left unanswered. The rancher wasn't evil, nor cursed. He was simply broken by a love that refused to fade. The land had become his confession, his punishment, and finally his peace. In a way, that quiet ranch had become a kind of grave for all who couldn't let go. The sheriff, the deputy, the widow, each of them drawn back by something unfinished. And maybe by the time the storm came that final night, it had given them the only thing they'd been asking for: release. In the generations that followed, the valley bloomed every spring without fail. Travelers still stopped there sometimes, drawn by something they couldn't name. Some said the light was better there, the air clearer, as if whatever once haunted the ground had turned into something that protected it instead. A few swore they'd seen two figures at sunset standing side by side near the old well, one tall, one smaller, before the light faded. The modern world would forget the story, of course. It would be rewritten, twisted into tales of ghosts and curses for those who craved fear more than truth. But for those who remembered the old ways, who still carried the whispers of that land in their hearts, the lesson remained the same. Love, when held too tightly, can destroy. But love, when let go, can heal even the earth itself. And so the rancher's story ended the way all true things do, not with fire or thunder, but with stillness. The land grew quiet. The wind carried nothing but the scent of grass and rain. The ghosts that once walked there had no more need for voices. Yet sometimes, when the wind rises after a long storm, you might still catch a whisper rolling through the valley, softer than a breath. It's the same voice that had haunted that place for so long, no longer broken, no longer afraid. "I can't hold it in anymore," it says. And this time, the wind itself seems to answer. "You don't have to."